This is the Law 401 podcast, legal issues decoded for you, brought to you by Roger Williams University School of Law. Hey everybody, my name is Nicole and I am one of the co-hosts, along with MDB over here, of Law 401, Legal Issues Decoded. So what we're trying to do here is take some serious, complex legal stuff and make it so that anybody can understand it.
Hi, I'm Michael, and my role on the podcast is to actually be your voice. I'm the non-lawyer in the podcast, and the issues we're going to talk about here in the state of Rhode Island are legally based. So I will try and bring it back to basics so that I can understand it, and hopefully you can too. I'm an associate dean at the law school, and Nicole?
I am an assistant dean for something, and I'm a professor. And at the heart of everything, I'm a librarian. But I'm really excited about access to justice and access to law. And so part of my reason for being here is so we can have conversations about legal issues that matter to Rhode Islanders and really everybody. And hopefully we do it in a sort of fun and understandable way.
And every episode we bring in lawyers, media folks, experts to talk to you about these issues. And so today, let's get into it. We have Ty Palermo from Barton Gilman in Providence, and the legal director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples here to talk about a historic land transfer here in Rhode Island.
And he is all of those. He is a policymaker. He is a advocate. He is a social justice person. He is an attorney. He's a former student of ours. He's a teacher, pretty much of an everything. Hi, Ty.
Hello.
So let's get into it. Today we're going to talk about a story that brings together history, land, and justice in a really powerful way.
Ty, just to sort of set the tone for the conversation, I know in law we call the area of law Indian law, but I don't think it's appropriate to call someone an Indian. But I'm not really sure when to use Indigenous, when to use Native American, when to use a tribal affiliation. How do I start this conversation in a way that's respectful?
Well, first of all, thank you for asking. Terminology is important in the law as it relates to Indigenous Peoples Rights. Words matter in particular. Broadly, when I do lectures, I say you may hear me use these words interchangeably, and that's because the context matters. And I also say it's not for you to use the words interchangeably unless you know the context. And so I think the, maybe quote, safest way to address Native American people who identify as Indian, Aboriginal, would probably be broadly Indigenous peoples. Indigenous is kind of really the global term. When you narrow it down to federal Indian law, which is the narrow body of federal law related to Native Americans, you're referring to, and I just used two terms in that sentence, is obviously Indian is the legal term that is a term of art, but also legally defined in a variety of contexts. American Indian is also a legal term defined in a variety of contexts. And so is Native American. And so in a federal legal context, you could be using those words interchangeably depending on the statute, depending on who you're talking about. You may hear folks say Indian, you may hear folks say Aboriginal. It really depends. You may hear Aborigine in New Zealand, Australia, the Maori people. You may hear Native in the context of Alaska Natives or Hawaiian Natives. And people who may be labeled as Hawaiian Natives may not necessarily accept that colonial label. They refer to themselves as Kanaka Maoli. So, you got to be really sensitive to the context. I think if you're trying to be safe, Indigenous peoples is probably the probably safest way to go.
And am I also correct that it's relative to sort of what time period you're in and what country you're in? I had a student from Canada who heard Indian law and was just absolutely flabbergasted and said, I will never say that word because in Canada it's a slur.
Sure.
And so right now, as we film this episode, you may be giving us the best news or the best way to do it. But going forward, it might change, and we just have to sort of build on some flexibility and some, respect and ability to be failure tolerant for when we make mistakes.
Sure. And also, two things can be true. Indian can be a dirty word, but it also refers to the body of law by which, you need attorneys to practice and represent Native Americans' rights. And so the use of the word, I think, matters.
Is that kind of like queer? Like that there's like, it's can be seen as a slur, but it also can be sort of reimagined and repurposed as a way to sort of take back for a community what someone has said about them or said negatively about them. And so it's going forward with intentionality seems to be the best way, and also understand that we may make a mistake.
No, absolutely, because the word queer can be perceived in so many different ways by so many different people at so many different ages. Well, let's get into the story we want to talk about today, which involves Brown University, the Pokanoket Tribe, and 225 acres in Bristol, Rhode Island. But more than that, it's a story about what it means to return land, honor ancestral ties, and build a more just legal future. Ty, let's get started. For someone hearing the story for the first time, can you walk us through what happened, what land was returned, and to whom?
Sure. So just a point of correction, it's 255 acres.
255.
And it's 255 of a larger 350-ish acre property that Brown held after was gifted to Brown from the Heffenreffer family, who had a museum there on the property. And Brown in 2017 had agreed to enter into discussions with the Pokanoket Tribe as a result of occupying the property, which is referred to as the Mount Hope property, historically referred to by the Pokanoket as Patumtuk, which refers to the Pokanoket Lookout. And Brown had held this property, had a relationship with the Pokanokets. They held events there, they held ceremonies there, but it was always disheartening to have to ask for permission to be on your own land. And just as a point of context, this is where the seat of the Massasoit lives. It is a granite stone massive structure that has a natural kind of carve out of a seat, like a throne almost. And King Philip Massasoit would sit there and hold council with all the other Pokanoket chiefs who were from a confederacy that spread throughout Southeast Mass and parts of Rhode Island. And so that is where the 1621 peace treaty with English colonists was signed. That's the place where we refer to as the first Thanksgiving.
Isn't that right by our campus?
It is. Right.
I thought that was in Plymouth.
Yes, that's the big myth behind that rock in Plymouth.
So Thanksgiving is actually a Rhode Island event.
Ironically, all things lead back to Rhode Island in some way historically, which, jokingly but seriously is monumental for this country's history and this little state that holds such rich history. To have the original peoples, the Sagamore, who Roger has given an honorary doctorate degree to, Dancing Star, the Sachem, her portrait hangs in the administration building.
What is a Sagamore and what is
Sagamore is like an elder chief. The Sachem is the chief of the tribe. And so Sagamore, William Guy, is the 11th great grandson of King Philip, direct bloodline. And his daughter, who we all know, Sachem Dancing Star, is the 12th in line. And so her sons, who are tribal members and tribal historians, carry that lineage. So this isn't some far-fetched, association. These are the direct blood descendants. And, to be back on that property, almost 400 years since the first peace treaty, to have Thanksgiving in 2024 back on the land by the original. That's a very powerful thing. And so Brown in 2017, after months of occupation by the Pokanoket, who were frustrated that at the time Brown didn't really care to kind of exceed that relationship beyond what it was, to their credit, brought the tribe to the table, and in doing so also included other tribes that are historically connected to the Pokanoket Confederation, the Pokanoket Nation, which, you know, if you don't know your history, the Pokanoket Nation was a conglomerate of tribes and nations and different bands that still exist to this day, that existed and ruled, you know, they're first. Go ahead.
What does the word band mean?
That's a good question. Band, clan, tribe can all interchangeably be thought of as like a family within a larger family. And so, you know, today we have the Pokanoket tribe that are the direct descendants from, you know, the main tribe of the nation that the Massasoit was the chief of chiefs of. And then we have bands of the Pokanokets that still exist, that have, as a result of the King Philip's War, had to rename themselves as Wampanoags, because it was an English law after King Philip's War to identify yourself as Pokanoket. They were banished from this area. Many of the resistance was shipped into slavery into the Bahamas. And so there's a big population of Northeast tribal peoples, families and bloodlines that have spawned out of the Caribbean. And so you have Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah Wampanoag, Pocasset, Pokanoket Pocasset. You have the Herringband Pond tribe of Wampanoag, who was just state recognized by Massachusetts. So Brown brought all these tribes. So they did their due diligence to make sure all the tribes with historical ties to that land were at the table. And over 7 years, some tribes stayed at that table, some didn't. Nonetheless, the Pokanokets carried the ball all the way to 2024 until Brown and the tribe were both comfortable and in a position to transfer this land to the tribe. And in doing so, the tribe took possession, and the deed to this land names all those tribes that were at that 2017 convening. So there's always going to be use and access to that land. And then in 2024, we closed on it on November 15th. And since then, now the tribe are stewards of 255 acres of undeveloped, conserved, preserved land and 2 miles of shoreline, which now, you know, as you well know, Nicole, who hosted our panel at our annual conference, now that you got the land back, there's a whole new world of now what that we're, you know, figuring out. What
do you think sort of made the timing happen? What sort of prompted Brown to act in 2024? What brought it all together?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, shout out to our co-founder and alum, Ray Watson, Two Hawks Watson. He was instrumental in the 2017 occupation. Because we come from community organizing backgrounds, you know, we know that, you know, peaceful disruption results in some sort of action. That peaceful disruption, and I'm sure probably his primetime feature at the time on Tucker Carlson, who, you know, on conservative media loves to drag, you know, like liberal institutions like Brown. And when you're in the field of advocacy, you take the press any way you can get it to elevate your issue. And it just was a convergence of factors that prompted Brown to come to the table. And to their credit, they stayed at the table. And I think that what happened was probably around 2022, 2023, talks kind of just fell off. Not really for anybody. You know, Brown isn't going to care more than the tribe to give them their land back. And the tribe had representation that wasn't really kind of moving the ball forward. And so they were kind of stuck. And it just worked out that we had finished law school, passed the bar, formed the Center for Indigenous Peoples Rights in a timely period to step in and pick the ball up and keep running with it. So what we did was we knew the mechanism to kind of get the engine going again was to have some sort of press around this. And it was timely because the year before, right before Indigenous Peoples Day, the Providence Journal had reached out to us because they had heard that we're now representing the Pokanokets and said, "Hey, what's up with the it's been 6 years since the 2017 thing. What's up with that?" And so we were able to use that interview, which ended up being the front page of the Sunday paper, as a call to Brown to kind of, hey, we're here now, let's get back to the table. And it did. A week later, their attorney reached out to me, and he was great to work with. They were great to work with. And once they all realized we were all on the same page to get this done, we got it done.
I'll just say I'm really proud of y'all and to Brown, frankly, for staying at the table and making this happen.
They did not need to, and credit should be given where it's due. You can. Two things are true: you can hold institutions accountable, especially Ivy Leagues, for all types of criticisms. But when they do the right thing, you got to give them their credit.
I think about I took a trip to Poland. I'm half Polish, and I'm half Polish American, if you prefer. And I went to Poland, and I went to the mountains where we can trace our family back to. And I stood there and I thought, like, oh, like, these are my people. Mm-hmm. And I had the, like, chills. I mean, it was cold because it was December in the mountains in Poland, but I never drove past that place every day. Mm-hmm. I never accessed that or had to ask someone to access that. Mm-hmm. I just had to travel there and be like, oh, this is great. I have a lot of empathy for someone who is part of the tribe and who has this, like, very strong connection to the land, mm-hmm. and the idea of, like, not ownership but stewardship, mm-hmm. having to drive past that land every day and knowing I feel like I am a steward for this land and I have to ask permission from a Ivy League institution to be granted it. Mm-hmm. But I also wonder, sort of from the law perspective, is it just like a closing, like any other, like, house closing? Like, what is the legal mechanism you used to transfer this? And is it transferred to a person, to a tribe? How exactly does this work?
Well, first of all, let me just say the closing was extremely underwhelming. I am, and that's fine. Underwhelming is okay. But
as a former real estate lawyer, an underwhelming closing means that a lot of good work by lawyers has come before.
And exactly. And, it's also, I think it was just underwhelming because everyone else understood the significance of that moment. And I don't even know if there was a whelming or overwhelming, moment that could have captured that. But it was literally a 20-minute, everybody signed, and then in order to encapsulate the moment, we actually took a picture in front of the lobby of the Brown's attorney. But to make it happen, what we did was, so the Pokanokets are not a federally recognized tribe, and the state of Rhode Island doesn't have a formal statutory scheme or government office dedicated to Indian affairs like Connecticut and Massachusetts do. And because our neighboring states have that, they have state recognized tribes and from those state recognized tribes flows state entitlements that are similar, but obviously not to the scale of federally recognized tribes who are entitled to federal entitlements.
Can I stop you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Can we just sort of back up and talk a little bit to our audience who are not lawyers about what federal recognition generally means and what the sort of history of all that is?
Sure. So federal recognition refers to tribes that are formally recognized by the federal government, which happens in one of three ways. Historically, it's always been through treaty, as a nation-to-nation relationship. When treaty making was kind of eradicated in Indian law as a way to kind of stop acknowledging additional tribal nations, but there were still obviously very apparent thriving tribal nations. They formed some tribes were recognized through acts of Congress, because Congress can recognize a tribe that way. And then tribes are, since I think it was 1978, the Office of Federal Acknowledgement was formed to formally create a petitioning application process for federal acknowledgement. And so today it typically happens through that Office of Acknowledgement. Very rarely, probably it's extremely hard to pass a congressional act. And, we don't really see the executive branch who can recognize another sovereign in any other context. We don't really see them doing that in the way they did in the 70s and 80s. The most recent is the Trump administration's push for the Lumbee tribe to be recognized. But you notice that they themselves aren't recognizing the Lumbee tribe through an executive action. They're kind of like compelling Congress to do that. So, and there's all kinds of nerdy legal reasons as to why that is. I'm not even going to get into that. But what's important to realize is that recognition is a relative term. So here in Rhode Island, because we don't have we don't have a state recognition process, we have a handful of tribes that are recognized through state statutes, through through state proclamations or Senate resolutions. The Manasean tribe from Block Island, they're recognized through a state statute. They are incorporated as a state nonprofit. They are a 501c3 tax-exempt entity, and they are also recognized in state statute as exempt from any taxation from property that they hold, real estate or tangible. So in any other, for all intents and purposes, they are technically aligned at the state level. Similarly, they're similarly positioned as a federally recognized tribe as it relates to kind of how they can operate within the state. Federally recognized tribes are under the sole jurisdiction of the federal government unless there is also something connected to their recognition that gives the state the authority. So in Rhode Island, we have one federally recognized tribe, the Narragansett Indian tribe. The center represents members there. One of their members is on our board. So we work, closely with our federally recognized tribes and state and non-otherwise recognized tribes. The Narragansett Indian tribe or other federally recognized tribes have what's referred to as a Land Claim Settlement Act. So the Narragansett Indian Land Claim Settlement Act gives certain jurisdiction to the state over the tribe. It looks different state to state, relationship between that federally recognized tribe and the state. Connecticut, it looks different for their two federally recognized tribes. Massachusetts has 3 federally recognized tribes. So recognition is a relative term. Let's go back to the Manasean in Block Island.
That was a lot.
There was a lot.
And so I say all that, I guess, probably for the layperson to know that federal recognition does not make one tribe more Indian than another. You have to really understand the broader context if somebody is saying they're recognized in some way. And you also may hear, since we're talking about terms, people referring to themselves as acknowledged rather than recognized, so as to communicate some kind of differentiating aspect of, formal versus informal, federal versus state. We like to say Rhode Island acknowledges Indian tribes because there's no formal recognition process. So it's the classic lawyer answer. Depends. It's a little nuanced.
Thank you.
I listened to a podcast called Pretendians.
Yeah.
And it's a portmanteau for pretend Indians.
I got it.
Maybe someone else out there didn't, but it was the idea that what does it mean to be Indian? And again, I don't mean to use a difficult word. What does it mean to be?
They're using.
Yeah, it doesn't mean to be indigenous. What does it mean to be part of a tribe? Yeah. What is the process for different tribes? I think that they were talking about one tribe sort of sells membership cards.
Yeah.
And that how do you prove your lineage? And what has the history been here and in Canada of people who have claimed Indigenous or Native heritage and then either find out later that they don't have it or are doing it to gain a benefit in some way. And so I learned a lot about that. I also learned a lot from you about sort of blood quantum. But it does seem like really big and murky, and maybe we should have him back for another episode.
Oh, absolutely.
Ty, I was recently in a museum in Chicago, and there were all these signs about cultural indigenous artifacts. And so there were like these cases, and instead of it was like basically empty cases with a sign over it. And it said that the artifacts that used to be in this case or display had been transferred to sort of a tribe or were part of ongoing litigation. And I found that to seem like a good thing, that they weren't just moving the exhibit and putting another exhibit up, that they were acknowledging that this cultural heritage is important. But can you talk about why it's important, and in a related way, why returning artifacts or returning land matters? And is this a trend? Is this happening more often or less often, and why?
Well, what you're seeing, what you just described, is actually the result of the Biden administration's rule change to NAGPRA, which is the acronym for the federal law that supports the return of these cultural items, human remains, things like that are held by these institutions. And what the Biden rule change, part of the criticism around NAGPRA as a law was that it had no teeth, meaning you couldn't there was no lawsuit you could file because somebody was violating it. It was just basically like they should consult with tribes if they're holding these things. So the Biden rule change required consent. Just adding the word consent meant that if you could not prove you had consent to display these items, you had to remove them and seek consent or return them. So that's why you saw that. In fact, there was a New York Times article, I think,
That's super
that
interesting.
overnight, the Museum of Natural History in New York City, where I'm from, had to shut down 3 wings of exhibits because of this rule change. And it happened all over the country. So the reason that's important, whether it's human remains, artifacts, or land, is because we're talking about restoring, repairing, undoing generations of dispossession. It is the return of these kind of like sacred items allows for the restoration of ceremony, of culture, of bringing literal family members home. We represent a group of Native Hawaiians, Kanaka Maolis, who have ancestral land patents, which is a whole thing of like land tied to your bloodline.
What? What is an ancestral land patent?
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into it, but basically before Hawaii became a state and was taken over by the United States, the Kingdom of Hawaii issued actual parcels of like deeds to Native Hawaiian property owners. And those deeds are valid forever in perpetuity to their descendants. And so we're dealing with second, third generation inheritance of these properties who are being dispossessed after the Lahaina fires and private developers. Point was, going back to NAGPRA, is that in Hawaii, they bury their dead in sand dunes. So where you may see sand dunes that people are bulldozing over, you are literally destroying burial sites. And so
I'm learning so much today.
Right? And so this what you witnessed was the first teeth given to NAGPRA to be able to give indigenous communities the ability and power to say, yes, you can display that, but we need some sort of compensation or lease agreement or licensing, or no, we want those back home. And I think to see wings of museums shut down and across the country is is indicative of how much has been taken and looted from people without their consent.
My dad's a minister. I think of this from like the religious perspective, like, but put aside some of like the sort of law part and just imagine that this isn't just your race or your genetics, it's also your religion.
Mm-hmm.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but for some people, you said this is like a sacred thing,
Mm-hmm.
and that your sacred object, whether that's an actual object or the remains of a human being,
Mm-hmm.
is been missing. I guess missing is sort of an unfair word. Taken, stolen, not in your possession. I think there's probably a spectrum of correct words, but and now, like, just thinking about it religiously, I think like, wow, that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, let's talk about it though from sort of the average Rhode Islander's perspective for a moment, right? Aren't these all native lands? And is there this sense, I think, that some people get really defensive about this because it's like, are you going to take my house next? Is my house on native lands? Is that my house on sacred lands? I got that through no fault of my own.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to folks like that?
I say, first of all, yes, this is all native. We are all guests here. Unless you are originally from these lands, we're guests. That's basically every non-Indian in the United States. Mm-hmm. So that is an indisputable fact. And that's where that fact begins and ends. Also true is that we're not uprooting a Target or a Walmart or kicking you out of your home. But what that also means is that if we really understand and believe these truths, then something like any Rhode Island house that goes on the free market in identified ancestral lands of an indigenous group, they would get first right of refusal to purchase it off the free market. That's not that crazy, right?
No.
But it's also like, you could see the counter to that. It's like, oh, well, why are they getting... But when you think about why, okay, well, at least they're buying it. They're not kicking somebody off or, how they purchase it, get funded for it, whatever. But, there are ways to navigate all of these things. Yale right now, Yale Law is working on this program with the Nipmuc tribe, of which their campus sits on their land, on something called a voluntary land tax, which means I know as the property owner, I am on indigenous land. I am going to voluntarily tax myself, which is essentially a donation to the tribe as a 501c3. And it's a charitable donation because they're a 501c3 tax exempt entity. And we frame it as a voluntary land tax. There's a formula that they're putting to it based on the value of the home, the size of the tribal community. It's a whole formula that they developed around it. So there are things like cultural easements. The Manasean tribe are trying to work out cultural easements with people who are elderly folks who are putting their homes on the free market to say, if you sell this, whoever buys it next, the deed will have a cultural easement in it so that the Manasean tribe can hold ceremony on this land. And so there are ways to work through and around the system as it has, evolved today, where we can hold the truth and not have fear. This isn't about guilting anybody. This is about justice for a group of people who have historically been dispossessed in a variety of ways. So I don't think it's something to be fearful of. I think it's something to lean into.
I think about also, what role does acknowledgement play? It is like maybe our first step. Maybe we don't all go out and contact a lawyer about cultural easements, but maybe we could start with sort of reading a book and acknowledging this, because I think even that's a pretty big step from where we've been. Mm-hmm. So I teach a class, I co-teach a class called Race and the Foundations of American Law at RWU Law.
Which Ty is also on the faculty of.
Yeah, and you also come and teach in that class. What is something you wish the average Rhode Islander understood about land, race, and the legal system in the country?
I think, at least as it relates to this conversation, the law as it relates to indigenous peoples, Native Americans, the first people of this first contact tribes in particular, is that law was designed for the purpose of theft. It was designed for the purpose of dispossessing the current inhabitants of their lands in particular. And so, the first thing is to understand we are operating from that place. And so how we interpret and use the law now is really in a corrective approach, a reformative, a restorative approach. And so, when you kind of understand the law was weaponized in that way, it makes it, I think, an easier pill to swallow to not maintain, to come from the place that we don't want to maintain the law as a weapon in that way. We can use it, we can weaponize it for good, but knowing its roots were based in that is important. In the class that we teach in, it's important that they understand that a lot of our legal systems rooted in race are also rooted in racist systems in medicine, in healthcare, in environmental justice. And so I think the first place is to understand that the law hasn't always been developed for good.
Brown says that this is the first land return of its kind from an Ivy League institution. Do you think it sets a precedent?
Absolutely. And, Brown should lean all the way into it. Not saying that they're not, but I mean, this is monumental. I mean, the thing is an acknowledgement is great. But an acknowledgement without action is, just words. And Brown has taken really the most action you can take, which is returning, it's not just the 255 acres to the tribe, but also the remaining 100 or so acres to the town of Bristol, who the tribe works very closely with. And so collectively now we have, this large swath of protected land for, not only the tribe's benefit, but all Rhode Islanders' benefit. And so there has never been an Ivy League institution that has returned land to this scale. And so this absolutely sets a precedent, and it shows that it's not scary. It's possible to do.
What advice would you give other lawyers or institutions, communities, or just average people listening that want to do something to acknowledge or to learn more or to act, but don't know where to start? Is this conversation about land back and acknowledgement, is this something scary, or is it perhaps present opportunities for collaboration or innovation, or like, I'm convinced I want to do something. What do I do? Is there a museum? Is there a book? Is there a person? Is there a conference? Mm-hmm. How do I dig in?
Yeah, well, fortunately for that inquisitive mind in Rhode Island, there is a lot. Rhode Island has, first of all, a state historical association and state archives that capture a lot of indigenous history, as well as African-American history and just cultural history in Rhode Island, which is, when I got educated on it, especially the Labor Museum in Woonsocket, of the cultural groups that have passed through here historically, it's amazing. But as it relates to especially the history of indigeneity, your town historical associations as well have served out numerous panels, from Bristol's Soam's project to Little Compton's historical association. There's rich history tucked in all Rhode Island towns. I had a student who was in my federal Indian law class while we were closing on this last fall in Patumtuck, and we were talking about the Pokanokets in Tiverton, and he happened to be on the Tiverton Town Historical Association, and pointed out to me a marker that the town has of the first Indian reservation ever created in this nation was for the Pokanokets by a group of English settlers. So in Tiverton. And so, the history is right there for you. At our libraries are a bunch of great books on the history in particular.
I didn't tell him to say that.
No, she didn't. I'm a huge library advocate. And so there are a large swath of historical texts on what the history of Rhode Island had around our namesake, Roger Williams and his relationship with the Indians. And so the easiest thing to do is first educate yourself, and then you'll be able to understand where I am in this state and relative to the indigenous groups from here. If you're in northern Rhode Island, you're talking about different tribal groups. If you're in Providence, you're talking about different tribal groups. If you're in the East Bay, you're talking about different tribal. South County, you're talking about different tribal groups. There's a lot of overlap between Pequots, Narragansetts, Pokanokets, Wampanoags, Nipmucks. So, these are all thriving communities in this state. So the easiest thing to do is to go to your library and look up text, to go to your state archives. And then you can always follow the center on Instagram or Twitter. I'm not on social media. I don't manage the social media. So you can go to our website for all those handles. But
we'll add all that in the show notes.
Yeah, we have a conference every year where we bring together law and policy practitioners. We just did one this past spring at the Foxwoods Resort and Casino with the Meshitucket Pequot.
And it was amazing. I learned so much.
And it was great. And so there are a lot of resources locally. And of course, we are always a resource. We are not a gatekeeper of information. We will happily demystify anything. Your community, your town council, anybody who wants a presentation, the center will pop up on a moment's notice to provide any kind of education around this, because Rhode Island just in its history has been just behind our neighbors in the development of an Indian Affairs department or statutory scheme. And so, as attorneys, as indigenous folks to this state, not me, but my colleagues, it's incumbent upon us to educate. And so you let us know and we will pop up a PowerPoint on a moment's notice.
All right. So this has been a really serious conversation, an amazing, serious conversation, but I only have so much tolerance for serious before we need to get to fun. So, Ty, we always end our podcast with a fun question. MDB, do you want to do the honors?
Sure. What's your favorite Bristol spot? As a former student, you must have some places you have that you love.
Actually, what has become my favorite spot is the shoreline on Patumtuck. And the reason for that is because I'm originally from Borinquen, which is Puerto Rico, and my people in particular are from what we refer to as Guanilla, which is what today as Ponce, Puerto Rico, the southern part of the island. So I'm a very water-centric. I need to be near water. And so I've found myself over the last several months, even while it was cold out, having like either meetings at or around the property. So I'm close to the water. And so it's also why I love Rhode Island. But I think in Bristol, it used to be that park over by off of, I don't know the name of it. It's, I usually go there for lunch with Greg.
Like Independence Park?
Independence Park, yeah. I like being over there. We did one thing at the Bristol Yacht Club. That was nice. I like the end of the road by Roger Williams underneath the bridge.
Oh, I love that spot.
That's such a great spot. But I gotta say, the shoreline at Patumtuck, where Three Sisters is actually the cultural landmarks. 3 massive stone structures that jet into the water. They call it Three Sisters. It's just really surreal and serene.
So as an Italian American, my other half, mine is Roberto's, which is a lot less, meaningful. But they do have a delicious bolognese. How about you?
I love Bristol Harbor. But I will say, when Ty said this, what I reflected on was when I first interviewed for and accepted this job over 2 decades ago. I remember walking down after the interview to where the Shell Path is now and sitting down on picnic tables and just absolutely falling in love with Bristol. So the very tip of Mount Hope with the Mount Hope Bridge there is my absolute favorite spot. Ty, I want to thank you for coming in today. I can't tell you for me what a full circle moment this has been. I think back to our very first conversation when you were an applicant so many years ago. We were talking about unrecognized tribes and the work that you and Ray Two Hawks Watson were thinking about doing. And it's just so gratifying to see the work where it's gone now and what this has meant, not just for me, but for the entire community, what you and your team have done. It's just so powerful.
Thank you. I appreciate your support since the beginning. You have been a constant, which, generally in life, the follow through is always the issue with folks. You've always come through. You've always been supportive. So extremely appreciative of you.
So thank you so much, Ty, for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for listening. And what we're asking is, if you like the podcast, if you can follow us on social media and hit the like button, give us a rating, leave us a comment. The more chatter we get, the more people will pay attention. It's a small state, and we hope we're able to reach the people who really want to learn more about Law 401, Legal Issues Decoded.
Thanks for tuning in to Law 401, Legal Issues Decoded from the Roger Williams University School of Law. We'd like to thank our guests on the show today. The Law 401 podcast wouldn't be possible without the generous funding from the Hassenfeld Family Foundation. We'd also like to thank executive producer from RWU Law, Helga Melgar, the RWU Marketing and Communications team, and our production partner, Focus Forward Media. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Roger Williams University or our partners. For more Law 401 episodes and updates, follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts on YouTube or visit law.rwu.edu.